Hi, Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss Aristotle's concept of ideal tragic hero, the characteristics of Aristotle's concept of ideal tragic hero. But before discussing the characteristics of the ideal tragic hero by Aristotle, let's have an introduction to this topic. Aristotle wrote a very famous book in the form of Poetics. In this book, Aristotle discusses his concept of tragedy, his definition of tragedy. He discusses different elements and parts of tragedy. He also discusses his concept of tragic plot in it. He discusses his concept of plot in greater detail than any other aspect of tragedy or drama. He also outlines his concept of tragic characters and hero in this book, Poetics. He puts forward many qualifications for tragic characters and hero. After that, Aristotle also discusses or highlights the qualities of ideal tragic hero. That what are the characteristics, what are the features of ideal tragic hero. He also discusses that in his book Poetics. While discussing tragic hero, Aristotle mostly keeps in mind the function of tragedy, that is, catharsis of emotions of pity and fear. He points out that tragic hero must have attributes that help him in the release of pity and fear by the end of the tragedy. Then Aristotle moves on to discuss the different aspects of the ideal tragic hero. He mentions the qualifications, chief qualifications for a tragic hero. He says that tragic hero must be a man from high social status. He must not be an ordinary man. He believes that a tragic hero should either be a prince or a noble or a general or a king, or he should have any other high position in the society. But he must not be a man from lower class of the society, or he must not have a low position. According to Aristotle, a man in high position arouses greater emotions of pity and fear. The greater contrast between the tragic hero's former glory and his current misery in the tragedy will create greater tragic effect on the part of the audience. However, this is not the case with an ordinary hero according to Aristotle, who doesn't have high position in the society. There is no real contrast between such a ordinary tragic hero's formal state and the current one. Thus, it fails to achieve the deeper and more intense tragic effect on the part of the audience. So, this is why Aristotle believes that tragic hero must be a man from high class of the society. He must be a high positioned personality. Then Aristotle moves on to discuss the second important qualification of a tragic hero. He says that a tragic hero must neither be a thoroughly good nor a thoroughly bad man. Both of them are unsuitable because they fail to arouse the emotions of pity and fear in real sense. It is the excitement and subsequent purgation of these emotions that is the real function of tragedy. When a thoroughly good tragic hero suffers, no doubt, the audience do not feel pity for him. But more than pity and fear, it is the emotion of disgust and revolt that is aroused. Sufferings of an angelic character create a sense of dissatisfaction in the audience. The audience question the universal scheme of things in which even a completely innocent man can suffer. This produces a sense of revolt against the universal justice. On the other hand, the tragedy of a completely bad tragic hero arouses satisfaction in the audience, not pity and fear. When a thoroughly evil-natured man suffers, the audience feels satisfied that he is being punished for his black deeds. The ideal tragic hero, therefore, must neither be completely good nor completely bad. Rather, he should be good. In other words, he should be the mixture of good and bad qualities, very much like real human beings. Finally, Aristotle states that a tragic hero must suffer due to hamartia. Now, Aristotle does not explain the term hamartia in his book Poetics. And hamartia is a Greek word which has no exact English equivalent. In the absence of any single clear explanation of this term hamartia, different critics have interpreted it in different ways. There are four major interpretations in this regard of the term hamartia. In other words, hamartia may manifest itself in four ways. In other words, it can be explained in four different ways. Firstly, hamartia refers to a single avoidable act that leads to calamity or tragedy on the part of the tragic hero. In other words, hamartia is an act that the hero could have avoided if he had waited and made better use of his sense of judgment. He does what he should not have done. This is clearly a moral act. The example in this regard can be given of the play, Shakespearean play, Macbeth. Macbeth's hamartia is that he takes the life of King Duncan, he murders King Duncan, and this murder could have been avoided by him. But he could not do so, he could not avoid it, and this led to his sufferings and ultimate tragic death by the end of the tragedy. So this is one interpretation of hamartia, single avoidable act. Second important interpretation of hamartia is that hamartia is a single unavoidable act. In other words, hamartia can also be called as an act of the tragic hero which cannot be avoided by the hero no matter what he does. The best example of this type of hamartia is displayed by the character of Oedipus the king in the tragedy Oedipus Rex. Here, Oedipus Rex commits an unavoidable act. In other words, Oedipus the king had to commit this act. He could not, or he was not in a position to avoid it. He had to commit it. So this is an interpretation of, second interpretation of the term hamartia. Thirdly, hamartia can also be interpreted as an act that the hero does consciously but not deliberately. In other words, he makes a conscious choice of an action, but he is not aware of its dangerous consequences for him. The example in this regard can be given of William Shakespeare's tragedy King Lear. In the tragedy King Lear, the character, commits the act consciously. He commits an error consciously, but not deliberately. In other words, he committed an act. He knew that what he is doing, but he could not realize the consequences of that act. As a result of that, he suffers and dies a tragic death. And last but not the least, definition of hamartia is that hamartia is a character weakness. In other words, hamartia means a tragic flaw, a tragic drawback found in the personality of the character of the hero in a tragedy, because of which he commits a mistake, and due to that he suffers and dies a tragic death. For example, Othello's weakness in his character was his jealousy. The fire of jealousy consumed him, and he was not able to think in a rational manner, in a logical manner, in a sensible manner. As a result of that, he suffers and dies a tragic death. Whereas, on the other hand, second important example of this tragic flaw is Macbeth's weakness, which was ambition. Because of his ambition, he kills the king of his own country, King Duncan, because of which he suffers and dies a tragic death. So this is the last but not the least characteristic of a tragic hero, which is hamartia. So we have discussed multiple definitions of the term hamartia, and in this way we discussed all the characteristics of the tragic hero, ideal tragic hero according to Aristotle. So this is it for today. Thank you very much.